Hello all, it's Dr. Perry again, here with this week's lecture. And one of the things that we're going to try to get to today is really kind of setting up what the slave is the 4th of July, but also covering the concept of epidictic rhetoric and what that means for the previous conversations that we had about the formation of community, specifically with respect to the concept of proto-publics. So what we're seeing here is that Plato, through Socrates, is critiquing his community and has some real concerns about Athens and the future of Athens. You're going to see in What to the Slave is the 4th of July that Douglas also shares a lot of concerns about what's happening in the United States, particularly with regard to slavery and the Fugitive Slave Act itself. So we're going to try to focus on the ways that people attempt to teach lessons in order to build a community. And we'll use What to the Slave is the 4th of July to do that because it's considered perhaps the finest piece of American public address ever delivered, but if not the finest, certainly at the top of the list. And most speech teachers would take the time to teach this speech in one way or another. So let's go ahead and set up this discussion for the week. Douglas was something of a celebrity in his time. He was the most photographed man alive during the height of his popularity. He did speaking tours throughout the Northeast. He did speaking tours in Britain, in the UK. He was a much sought after speaker. People wanted to hear what he had to say. There were a lot of different reasons for that. We don't necessarily have time to go into all of them. But this would be the equivalent of being able to see one of the preeminent political speakers of the present speaking. You would pay a good amount of money to get in, and it was the door price. And it would have been, if you keep in mind that public speaking at the time was one of the forms of entertainment that would have been more prominent, given that professional sports as we regard them didn't exist. Music and concerts would have existed, but certainly not in the form that we think of today in terms of stadiums or big arena type concerts. So Douglas is very much a celebrity of his time. And it's really interesting to think about that, given that a lot of what he is telling people is stuff that they probably wouldn't want to hear or that they would be very embarrassed about figuring out as they're being taught about the ills of slavery and about the ways that people who are held in slavery are being treated. He wants to be able to share that knowledge. He's trying to give them a chance to learn about slavery and learn about what it would be like to be a slave, but also now that he is a free man, trying to explain his position in relation to citizens of the United States when he himself does not enjoy the full rights of citizenship as white folks would have at the time. We call this epistemic rhetoric because epistemology is a philosophy of teaching. And the genre of rhetoric used to teach is epistemic. Now, within epistemic rhetoric, you can teach by giving demonstrations, you can teach by trying to impart values or certain types of skills, or providing a history that people may not know. Douglas is blending a lot of these different things as he moves through the speech. He's very adept at weaving different types of teaching and trying to take different moments within the speech to demonstrate different values, but also to illustrate pieces of history that people may not have considered, and certainly modes of interpreting history that a lot of Americans wouldn't have considered at this point. So when you are analyzing Douglas, remember that you are doing this for essay 1. You're going to be applying a framework. It's not whether you agree with Douglas's assessment of the founding fathers, of the church, of any number of things that he is going to critique and the ways that he is going to address them. We're not asking you whether you personally agree with Douglas, but whether or not from a values perspective, Socrates or Plato, who's written his character of Socrates, would find value in the way that Douglas is addressing his audience. Keep in mind that even as Socrates critiques speeches as a genre in both Gorgias and Phaedrus, that ultimately he ends up making speeches. So you're going to want to avoid making claims like the Greeks would not, or Socrates would not have liked what to the slave is the 4th of July because it's a speech, and Socrates said he did not like speeches. That's not what we're after here. You're going to want to avoid comparisons like the Greeks had slaves, so Socrates would not have understood why Douglas was so upset. Instead, what you're looking for are these recurrent themes connected to transcendent truths in a way that each of these speakers, or Socrates as a character and Douglas as a speaker, is attempting to teach the people that they address how to build a community that is, in a sense, truer to its own values and truer to its own principles. In all likelihood, your papers are going to include positive assessments of Douglas's speech because Douglas is after transcendent ideas of what it means to be an American, which mirror in some ways the ways in which Socrates was after transcendent ideas of what it meant to be an Athenian. We're going to have another lecture that addresses some of the nuts and bolts of Essay 1. So I'm not going to go deeply into that. I just want to keep setting up what's going on in Douglas for now. The speech itself is delivered on July 5th, which is in the head note, but it's something that a lot of people tend to skip over. The fact that it's delivered on July 5th shows that Douglas is not willing to celebrate July 4th. In fact, he's very interested in using this date as a means of protest. And a lot of African-American Black folks, right, would have used July 5th as a day at this point in history to kind of serve as a counter celebration or a protest. The speech, of course, is attended by a limited audience, but it is reprinted and published as a pamphlet, and it would have been published, excerpts of it would have been published certainly in prominent newspapers at the time. So he gives the speech at the invitation of William Lloyd Garrison, who is the publisher of The Liberator, which is a newspaper that had wide circulation as well. Douglas was to refute charges that he had been seditious while on a speaking tour of the UK. So that is to say, while Douglas was in the UK, he was critical of the United States and the system of slavery that persisted within the United States. And people who were sensitive to that claim and that critique accused him of sedition. So what kinds of claims does Douglas make specifically? He uses a second person address. It is the birthday of your national independence, of your political freedom. Why would he be using that second person language as opposed to a first person plural of we? Who is his audience? Who would have been reading this in the form of a pamphlet? You'll see here to the side that I've included a manifest or a log which records the price of slaves that were sold at auction and notes their age as well as their names. If you think about putting a price on a human being and what it is that Douglas is trying to convey, especially in the descriptions and the metaphors that he uses to talk about slavery and the practices put into effect on the auction block, you start to see the power of the speech. You're really going to want to get into kind of the nuts and the bolts and the particulars of what Douglas is doing with the specific sorts of examples that he gives. In the introduction, he says, "I'm glad, fellow citizens, that your nation is so young." He keeps talking about the age of the United States and the fact that the United States itself has a chance to correct course. So he's not talking about abolishing the United States. He's not talking about getting rid of the Constitution. He's talking about making changes. He gives suggestions of the types of changes that would need to be made in order for the United States to more fully incorporate more of its people and to avoid and expunge the evils of slavery, the sins of slavery. So a lot of what Douglas is doing here is putting things in perspective and projecting a means by which we might be able to build a community. You're going to want to note how Douglas approaches the founders. What is it that he says about the people who created the Constitution and signed the Declaration of Independence? The risks that they were willing to take and the risks that they weren't willing to take. How does that line up with the mythologies of the founding that we have now? How does it line up with the ways that we sort of reverentially celebrate the 4th of July even today? Or do we use these holidays maybe as a moment of reflection to think about the values of what it means to be an American or the history of who was an American? These are distinctions that Douglas is going to make pretty clear in his speech. Douglas is also going to approach the church harshly. He's going to be pretty direct about the interpretation of particular Bible verses and the role of the church in not speaking up. He's going to have an argument about silence that's going to be really important. This is really important because slavery was often justified through particular passages in the Bible and was often justified by white clergy. At the same time, there were white clergy who were protesting slavery and saying that it was sinful, that it was evil. Black clergy are also developing a style of preaching and developing foundations and church organizations that are going to be at the backbone of not only resisting slavery, but will continue on for generations to champion the civil rights of Black folks in the United States. So keep in mind that Douglas is setting up an argument that had predated his own advocacy, but will continue long after his advocacy in terms of the criticism of the church as an institution. Where do the true, the good, and the beautiful occur within the speech itself? You've been able to isolate this within Platonic dialogues. As you isolate those moments in the Platonic dialogues, you're going to be doing kind of a literary comparison between Douglas and the Platonic dialogues. So go through and ask these questions as you're reading. Write in the margins of your text. Make annotations and think about the ways that these capital T truths specifically in a relation to capital J justice would take place, and what both sets of texts are saying about the nature of justice and injustice in their communities. So as we think about that, a lot of these things are going to be definitional arguments. Certainly Socrates is interested in the idea of definition by negation. Does Douglas do the same thing? What terms does Douglas take the time to define? What terms did Socrates take the time to define? This is going to tell you a lot about the structure of the argument and give you a basis for a close textual comparison of the text involved. And finally, one of the things that you're going to look at here is what is the relationship of each person here to their government? They're being very critical of their society, very critical of the current conditions, and they're going to lay a lot of blame at the feet of the people who are in charge at a given moment. But both of them still seem to have an idea of being able to redeem their communities and the ideas that are the foundations of their communities. What does it mean to be critical of one's own government while still having hope for one's own community and building that community? What does it mean to teach people to be a citizen in the way that you think is ethical or moral? How do these texts go about doing that? So what is the epistemological function of these texts in terms of teaching people how to be citizens of their respective communities? And what do you think they do well in terms of appealing to transcendent values? All right, we will put up another lecture on Essay 1, and I will talk to all of you next week. Thank you.